Welcome back, everybody. Today we're looking at Chapter 11, Section 4, Part 2. And then today we're going to be talking specifically about Florida and the Monroe Doctrine. So our essential question for today is, what was the significance of the Monroe Doctrine? Now, if you remember, yesterday we were talking about revolutions in Latin America leading to independence for a lot of these Latin American nations. Well, today we're going to look at how that impacted the United States and some of the things that will come out of that. So, first things first, let's take a look at our key terms. Some of these should look familiar from yesterday, but I just wanted to touch on them a little bit again today. We have Creole, Republic of Great Colombia, and the United Provinces of Central America. Those are all things that we talked about yesterday. But then today we're going to be talking about the Monroe Doctrine, and we'll also mention the term intervention, which just means direct involvement. That may be a term that you've heard in reference to school, like giving interventions for math or for reading, trying to give direct involvement to help students. Well, in this sense, intervention would be one country directly involving themselves in another one. But to kind of backtrack a little bit, to kind of get us back in a swing of things, I want to quickly review what we discussed yesterday in regards to these new nations popping up in Latin America. Well, if you remember, the new nations in Latin America based a lot of their constitutions on the U.S. Constitution, but the geography of Central and South America made independence very difficult because the land is just immense. And the American colonies had some experience in self-government, but Spanish colonies really did not, which resulted in most of them falling to dictators, much like the Roman Republic that we discussed in Chapter 7. And that's all well and good, but you're probably saying to yourself, Mr. Hubner, I thought that this class was called American Nation, and that we would be talking about the United States. Well, we are, and we will be. But it's hard to talk about only the United States when so much is going on so close to home. So today, as we continue our discussion in Chapter 11, Section 4, about the rise and fall of independence in Central and South America, we're going to, like I said, shift our focus back to the United States, how it was affecting life and policies, and how the policies that urged in response to what was going on in Latin America. But first, Florida. So we know that Spain lost a lot of its colonies in Central and South America to revolutions, but another one of its colonies, Florida, it lost to the United States. Now, why would the United States want Florida? Remember, there's no Disney World yet at this point. Why would they want it? Well, for one thing, Florida was attached to the continent, and it was attached to the ever-growing country, so some people just thought it was our destiny to have Florida and for it to become a part of the United States. In the South, some of the white Southerners wanted Florida because it had become a haven for runaway slaves. And there had been fights along the border with Creek and Seminole Indians that called Florida home. So they wanted to get Florida to be able to kind of take care of this and to get these runaway slaves back, as well as kind of end these wars with the Creek and Seminole Indians. But whatever the reasons, many Americans had Florida in their sights, and one way or another, Spain was going to lose this territory. And one of the reasons that Americans living in Georgia specifically wanted to take Florida was because of the so-called Black Seminoles living there. Now, we're going to backtrack a little bit. Since the early 1700s, Spain had protected any slaves that were able to escape into Florida. And the Seminole Indians living there allowed these escaped slaves to live and work near their villages, And in return, the escaped slaves shared a part of their crops with the Seminoles and adopted a lot of their customs. Now, the Seminoles had taken slaves of their own and at one point had participated in the slave trade, but generally those slaves were treated very well, and a difference from American slaves is that these slaves, their children were not slaves. So if a man and woman were captured and taken into slavery, if they had children, those children were not necessarily slaves, whereas in the American South, children of slaves were slaves, and so on and so on and so on. So they had a lot better time and a lot more opportunity in Florida with the Spanish government as well as the Seminole tribes. And this next video is going to give a little bit more insight into the Black Seminoles.
While it is commonly thought slaves were trying to escape to Canadian cities such as Montreal as seen here, in reality, most were not attempting to go to specific places, but instead were just trying to escape from the horrors of slavery. They went to any place where life hopefully was better and more secure, and where they were able to live in peace, where they weren't beaten and required to toil long hours in terrible conditions. Many slaves fled to Cuba or Florida or Mexico. In the swamps of Florida, they lived amongst the Native American Seminoles and were known as Black Seminoles. Many escaped slaves found refuge in free black communities in northern cities and lived among houses such as these owned by free blacks. Here they were helped by free blacks to find work, shelter, obtain an education in this integrated school, and could more easily hide in the established community.
So these escaped slaves eventually built settlements and forts of their own in Florida, especially in the western Florida panhandle. And it was these forts that really started to worry slave owners just across the border in Georgia. And one fort in particular, we're actually looking at the map of it right now, was known as the Negro Fort. And this fort had been built during the War of 1812 by the British, and originally known as the British Post. And it had been built by the British to serve as a recruitment base for escaped slaves and Indians living in the area. Now, following the war, the fort was abandoned by the British, and its surrounding lands became home to close to 1,000 escaped slaves and Black Seminoles. And the fort was located along the Apalachicola River in Florida's panhandle, only about 60 miles from the border with Georgia. And because it was so close, many of the planters in Georgia were afraid that the fort would serve as inspiration for their slaves to revolt against them, so they asked the U.S. government to step in to protect their interests. Now, if it was up to General Jackson, he would have just gone in there and completely eliminated the fort. That's what he wanted to do, but because Florida was still Spanish territory, neither he or the U.S. government could really do anything. The fort was in Spanish territory. It was not in American territory. It was in Spanish territory. So Jackson sends demands to the governor of Florida and in April of 1816. And these demands said that the Spanish needed to get rid of the fort, and if they did not do so, he would. So the governor of Spain, the governor of Florida, sees this and responds that he didn't have the means to get rid of the fort. He didn't have a way to. So Jackson assigned this man, Brigadier General Edmund Gaines, to go in and take care of the fort. So Gaines sent a force up the Apalachicola River because, as he said, it was the best route between Fort Scott in Georgia and New Orleans. So he had to go up the Apalachicola River. It was the best way. And by going that way, it would take the supply fleet right past the Negro Fort? Yeah, you can see where this is going. So the supply fleet on the Apalachicola River, moving north into Georgia, goes past the Negro Fort, and in July of 1816, a force was also sent down the Apalachicola River to meet up with that supply fleet, and they attacked. The first waves of attack were defended well by the inhabitants of the fort, but when a hot shot hit the fort's powder room, and a hot shot was a cannonball that had been heated so much that it was glowing, so like almost on fire itself. Once it hit the powder room, the explosion killed almost everyone inside and completely destroyed the fort. And it was said that the explosion was so big that it could be heard 100 miles away in Pensacola, Florida. So the fort was destroyed, but Florida was still a part of Spain until 1818, when General Jackson again invaded with a force, this time of 3,000 soldiers. Jackson took his forces down the Apalachicola River to where the Negro Fort had once stood and constructed a new fort, Fort Gadsden. And from there, Jackson started launching attacks on Indian villages and towns across western Florida. How do you think the Spanish government felt about this? Well, if you think that they're furious, you are correct. The Spanish government was furious about these attacks within their own territory by U.S. forces. But they really didn't do anything to stop Jackson, other than simply say they were very angry about those attacks. Why? Well, at this time, Spain was too busy trying to deal with all the rebellions that we talked about in yesterday's section, and they really didn't have the means to try and risk a war with the United States. And also, that whole Napoleon thing going on. So eventually, Spain agrees to peace talks, and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams apologized for the invasion of Western Florida. He stated that such an invasion was not American policy, and ended up blaming it all on the British, the Spanish, and the Indians living in that area. Not sure exactly how he did this, but he did, and it somehow worked. So finally, in 1821, Spain sold Florida to the United States for $5 million under the terms of the Adams-Onis Treaty. And the treaty ended the conflict with Spain and gave the U.S. full control of all of Florida. And we're looking at a picture of a map of the Adams-Onis Treaty. And you can see that now the United States has the area of Florida. That's the area that had been ceded by Spain. And a new boundary line was drawn that went west of what is now the state of Louisiana, up along the Red River, along the 100th degree west, up to the Arkansas River, and then along the 42nd degree north line of longitude. So as of 1821, this is your United States.
The early 1800s found slaves from the South escaping to Florida, where they lived in all-black villages or with the Seminole Indians. This made slave owners angry at the Spanish, who owned this territory, because the Spanish would not make the Indians return the slaves. Under President James Monroe, General Andrew Jackson led U.S. troops against the Seminole Indians of Spanish-held Florida. This began the Seminole War of 1818, leading to the American acquisition of Florida. Florida was purchased in 1819, and Andrew Jackson was made its governor. Under the Adams-Onis Transcontinental Treaty, Spain agreed to cede all of Florida to the United States in exchange for the dismissal of a $5 million debt. In addition, Spain gave up all claims to the Oregon Territory. The Florida Cession gave the United States parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and all of Florida.
Which brings us to the Monroe Doctrine. And our good buddy here, everybody's favorite president during the era of good feeling, President James Monroe. Now, the more that these Latin American nations fought for independence, the more the citizens of the United States cheered them on. The Americans were really, truly excited to see their neighbors struggling for the independence that they had fought for twice just a few years prior to that. And they were fighting for it and winning that independence. So everybody in the United States is like, yay, Latin America! Fight the Spanish! You guys are awesome! But starting in 1815, President Monroe and Secretary of State Adams started getting nervous concerning the actions of some of Europe's more powerful nations and the potential consequences for the Western Hemisphere. During that year, during 1815, Prussia, France, Russia, and Austria formed an alliance called the Concert of Europe, and they formed this alliance to put down any revolution that might spring up in Europe. Now, what does this have to do with the Western Hemisphere? Well, it seemed like this alliance was also gearing up to help Spain try and regain its lost colonies in Latin America, which bothered the United States and also bothered Great Britain, because Spanish influence might disrupt the valuable trade that they had set up in the Western Hemisphere. So you have this combined with Russia's claim on lands in North America's Pacific coast, which prompted Great Britain and the United States to issue a joint statement that would guarantee the freedoms of the new nations in Latin America. Now think about this. The United States and Great Britain had just ended the War of 1812. Now the country that we had just fought wants to team up with us to oppose the rest of Europe. It's kind of crazy how alliances can form over common enemies, and how true the statement is, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So Monroe looks at what's going on in Europe, is ready to team up with Great Britain, but then decides to take a stand even without the help of Great Britain. So in 1823, he sent a message to Congress that stated exactly what his foreign policy was going to be. And it's come to be known as the Monroe Doctrine, and it would keep with the U.S. policy of non-interference, saying we're not going to do anything in Europe, but Monroe took that policy a few steps further. So the first part of the Monroe Doctrine, the United States would not interfere with the affairs of any European nations. So this kept with Washington's tradition of staying out of the affairs of Europe. But the new part to it, if any European nations interfered with either the United States or one of the nations in Latin America, the U.S. would be forced to take action. Did any of the Latin American nations ask for this? But we said it anyways. So, along with that, the United States would oppose any attempt to build colonies in the Western Hemisphere, and would see any such attempt as a threat. So Monroe was determined to keep the United States separate from Europe by any means necessary. Whatever happens in Europe can stay in Europe, but as soon as you come over to this side of the planet, we're going to take issue with that. Now, the United States had no way of backing up these claims with military might, but Great Britain agreed with the Monroe Doctrine, and they were still one of the world's great military powers, even though we beat them twice. So Britain could use its navy, still arguably the best in the world, to keep other European nations out of the Western Hemisphere. So the United States now had the brawn to back up its claims. It's difficult to emphasize how important this document was, this Monroe Doctrine, because this statement would become the basis for American foreign policy for the next 100 years. And as the country's strength grew, the ability to counter European intervention or European direct involvement in Latin America grew. And by the early 1900s, the Monroe Doctrine was even used to justify sending troops into Caribbean nations. The original goal of the doctrine was to keep Europe out of Latin American countries, but eventually it was going to be used by the United States to justify its own involvement in these very same countries. And our last video is going to look a little bit more in depth at the Monroe Doctrine.
During the first quarter of the 19th century, besides Mexico, almost every other important colony in Latin America gained independence from its mother country in Europe. However, as this occurred, certain powerful monarchies in Europe threatened to stamp out representative governments if they developed in the old colonies. That was the reason that in 1823, President James Monroe issued his now famous policy statement called the Monroe Doctrine. In it, Monroe warned the European powers that he would consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. In other words, the Monroe Doctrine warned the European monarchies that they could expect a strong response from the United States if they interfered with the affairs of any independent nation in North or South America. The ideas spelled out in the Monroe Doctrine were very important and continued to shape American foreign policy to this very day.
Which brings us to today's forum assignment. So for today's forum, I want you to take a second and think back to everything we discussed in Chapter 11. Yeah, that was a lot of stuff. I know there have been a lot of topics, but some may have stuck out to you more than others. So I want you to use today's forum as kind of a way of helping yourself review and reviewing with your classmates for the upcoming Chapter 11 test. So in today's forum, please list 5 new things, 5 new pieces of information that you learned in Chapter 11. And here's a couple of examples of some of the things we discussed. How the Industrial Revolution made its way to America. President James Monroe ran for a second term unopposed because the air of good feeling, and the importance of the Monroe Doctrine on American foreign policy. So these are just a couple of ideas of things that we discussed in Chapter 11. Whatever 5 you choose, please list each one, list each thing that you learned, and give a brief sentence describing what you learned about that topic. So, for instance, I learned even though the Federalist Party had basically ended with the election of Thomas Jefferson, new leaders started speaking up for their own sections of the country, etc., etc., etc. So you will be given 10 points for your first post, which, if you break it down, 2 points for each piece of information, so 2 times 5 is 10, and 2 points for each time you reply to at least 2 of your classmates. So the total that you can get for this is 14 points. And please use complete sentences in your descriptions, more than just, I want just a list of President Adams, President Monroe, President Jefferson, Adams-Onis Treaty. Give me a description of what you learned about that thing and why you thought that it was interesting. So please write with using complete sentences. You don't have to write full paragraphs for each one, but enough to describe whatever event, person, location that you learn about and why it's significant. Okay? Have a great rest of your day.